Hey guys, welcome back to the series on Claude Code and getting the most out of Claude Code in your development setup. Now, in the last video, we talked about initializing Claude Code with a /init command. And in that video, I introduced the concept of using context in Claude Code in your terminal, using things like the /memory or the hashtag shortcut. And these are very powerful ways to control context. Now, I did also emphasize to you how important context is. Trust me, it's super important. Increasingly, as you review the literature from 2025, we're now almost at Christmas, we will see that the folks who are really deep in the AI lab territory or who are very, very deep into AI engineering, both from the model development side and also the model use side and application development layer, are talking about how, well, maybe RAG's not the whole answer. In fact, even things like MCP have been, questioned as to, well, hang on, how much context problems is this causing? Anthropic themselves raised this question in a recent blog where they talked about how to do better and more effective agent engineering using MCP, because the challenge with MCP can be that it floods the context with a lot of tools and that pollutes the context scape. And then what that ends up doing is it causes hallucinations or incorrect tool calling, etc. Now, I'm going to share the screen with you for just a second to emphasize how important this is, because yep, this is the blog from Anthropic, right? And it talks about consume context as each definition and result. So they found a better way rather than using MCP directly is to just give it an API, often in TypeScript, in fact. And I think Theo did a really cool video on this. He was very critical, but he did an interesting video and you learn a lot. And it appears that even the Anthropic guys may have learned about this a little bit from Cloudflare's blog on the matter on how they're starting to use API definitions instead of MCP, not instead of, but in conjunction with rather, because the MCP can have the challenge of, injecting a ton of tool definitions into the context scope. Now, I'm sort of going off track there a little bit. What I'm trying to emphasize there to you is that context engineering is actually possibly the most important part of all of this, right? In fact, I recommend that you take a look at this blog as well by the guys at Manus. This is by PG. It's a really, really interesting analysis. And when was it? It was from middle of the year. I think they've been on a couple of podcasts since then, where they talk about how context engineering is possibly far more important than any of the other tools, and it becomes part of the harness, right? The thing that wraps around the model. So you have the model, which is very powerful, and then you have the harness around it, which is all your control code around it and all the context and management stuff that you do. So context management is getting to be incredibly important in the successful use of LLMs. Even as the model itself gets stronger, it's really important to control its context. And that's why this video is really about how to use your context management inside Claude Code in your code base. Now, not all of that's going to be agentic use, but understanding the principles of context management means that you can get the best and fastest results from your use of Claude Code. The simplest way of thinking about this is how when we get information overloaded, we find it really hard to focus on one thing, our thoughts get muddled. It's exactly the same thing with an LLM in principle, right? If you give it too much context, it's going to start putting its attention in fragmented ways in different parts of it. That'll cause hallucinations, exactly like a human would get mixed up and confused and muddled up, right? So in Claude Code, the context window is about 200,000 tokens. That works out to about 75,000 lines of code, maybe about 150,000 words, about 400 pages, give or take. Now, these are just pieces of data that I pulled out from Google searches and from asking the LLMs about roughly how much would a 200,000 context window be, right? Now, this feels like a lot, right? Like to say 150,000 words or 400 pages of text, it feels like near infinite until you realize two things. There's something called context rot, which is very real, which is the degradation of performance the more things you put in context. So even, for example, Google and a few others that now offer the 1 million token context window, the performance isn't 5 times more as you'd expect, because there is something called degradation, right? When there's too much in the context window. So we, as the operator, as the developer, have to control what the model is putting its attention on. After all, remember, these are attention control mechanisms. It all started, the modern generative AI LLM all started from this Google paper called Attention is All You Need. It's a control of attention mechanism. It's a mechanism that controls the model's attention, right? So we have to play a part in that. We have to control the model's attention. Now, what happens if you dump your entire code base into a prompt? Let's take a code base here. I've just picked up something, from Adi Osmani's post recently on LinkedIn, where he had his version of Jarvis demo to show the Google Live API, the live service API, right? So I wanted to poke around and understand a little bit more about how it works, especially how the live service is set up and all that. And that's what you're seeing on the screen. You don't have to worry about the code too much. What I'm trying to say is this is a relatively small code base, right? It's, probably 10,000 lines or something at most, right? It may not even be that. So this is not a big deal. Like if you put this, if you ask the Claude Code to summarize the whole thing, it may be okay. But what happens if you, for example, try to do something much larger? Let's say open the Google generative AI repo itself, right? This one's pretty big. It's got all their various, product-based examples. And you don't want to be in a situation where you're stuffing all this into the model's memory. There's stuff in TypeScript, there's stuff in Python. There's a lot here. It's all of Google's sample and demo apps for generative AI, right? So this is definitely not ideal. I'm just going to close out of that one. So what we want to do is always try and control the attention. Let's say it was that big repo we were working. What are the tools we could use? Well, the first one that I want to bring to your attention is the use of memory, both from your Claude MD locally in the project, but also in your user level. And I covered this in the previous video. But the simplest way to do this, and let me fire up Claude here, is to make sure that you maintain the context window in a given thread. Now, every time I fire up Claude, this becomes a new conversation thread, right? So in this one, for example, what I would want to do is make sure that when I'm asking it a question, I only ask it about a specific, file. So I'm going to say, in this file is the file to look at, summarize the key operations and why they're used and why they're necessary, right? Now, what am I doing here? I am going to give this Claude Code only one file to look at rather than the whole code base. Now, Claude Code is actually very good at summarizing the whole code base. For most tools, they'll be able to do it okay. But that's because Claude Code and the Anthropic team have given it ways in the harness to control its attention by looking at files and doing quick summaries using Bash rather than sending everything off to the model. It does a lot of pruning and control management and context management before it actually does that. But I'm trying to explain to you what sort of utilities you have inside of Claude Code to control its attention, right? To basically put certain things in its context. Now, using the @of, so I could say ignore @of, I don't know. Let me see. Maybe I could say, tool service, right? Ignore that. Right. So I'm giving it very specific things to look at and very specific things to ignore, even though it says here red tool services, right? It shouldn't have done that ideally because I said ignore. So there you go. It just shows that, often these LLMs will still ignore it. But you'll see that after it read that, but then it only produced the outputs for audio utils, right? So in many senses, this wasn't a great job, I don't think, because it read 105 lines. It should have totally ignored it. But, I did mention it, so perhaps it felt the need to look at it. But the use of @of with the file is critical to control the context. That's one thing that I think is really worth you guys remembering. Not different from how you use it in cursor and stuff. So this is more of a beginner level thing, right? Now, the other thing that is worth looking at is, for example, if I were to do the context here, right? It visualizes the current level of context, which is not a lot. It just tells me, well, the system prompt, again, we covered this in the previous video, has 3.2 tokens. The system tools, right, which is all the function calls, which is what the MCP blogs are all about, that Cloudflare and Anthropic talk about. Just look at how many tokens. It consumes 7.9%, almost 10%. Well, that's a bit of a stretch, but 7.9% of my entire context window that I have is just the tool. I'm not even using these right now, right? That's the sort of context bloat that can happen in MCP that people are warning against. Here it makes sense because these are tools that Claude Code needs to actually be Claude Code for you, right? But note that this is the current stats around, how things are being used, right? Now, I could compact this. Obviously, I'd do this when I've had a much bigger conversation. In compacting, what it does is it basically squishes your entire chat history and all the back and forth into a concise summary, a salient summary. Now, as of version 2.0.64 of Claude Code, as I understand it, compacting is automatic and it's very fast, right? So you shouldn't, in theory, need to run compact. I still would every now and then, but what this does is it squishes the entire history into a summary, and then that frees up space in your context, and the LLM still has the key information available. I understand that compact may also be doing certain other things, like writing certain things to files, so that your files are your memory, and that can be pulled in as needed rather than polluting the context window. So rather than holding it in memory, we just put it in post-its. It's the same thing. Basically, what Claude Code would end up doing is putting little bits of data into little files in your file system as little post-its, saying, hey, if I need it, I'll come back to you later on, but I'm not going to clutter my mind with this kind of stuff, right? So you see, when you do /compact, it gives you a clear conversation history, but keep a summary in context, and it's, you can give it instructions for summarization, which I won't do here. But let's see what happens when it says, okay, it's compacting conversation, and then we should see a slight difference between the last time we call context to see what happens, right? So let's give that a couple of seconds. It's supposed to be faster. I don't really see it as being faster at the moment, but perhaps this is something that will get done fairly quickly. Okay, and there you have it. It said it compacted that. I'm not quite sure. I'm quite curious to see what it did. right? So basically this is its entire, I did control O to see its, its reasoning, right? To see the full summary, but that's basically telling you what the new summary is going to look like in the context window, right? Now, let me type /context again and see what happens. Is that any different? Well, you wouldn't expect the system prompt and system tools to be any different, but because I press compact, you'll see that I can't actually scroll up to my previous context. I'd forgotten about that. I should have taken a screenshot. But because I compacted, I kind of lost all that message history, and instead I just have the summary now, which I can see if I go back here. Now, the other thing I could do is just do clear, right? Clear is basically completely clears the conversation history and frees up all the context without any summary. Okay, so I could just do that, gone. Now, here's one of the cool things that I like. There are a couple of situations that I found when coding that I may go into a rabbit hole or I may open up multiple threads. Now, what happens if I want to see what threads I've started? Because I've been working on this project on and off for the last week, let's say, and I don't remember the conversations I've had and where they were. Well, one way you could do that is by, if you went into Claude, you could do /resume and it will give you a list of the conversations. Or let me cancel Claude for now. And I can do Claude and then do a resume. -- continue will continue the last thread, but -- resume will give you a menu of options about which ones to resume from, right? So this one, the first one, audio format, is the one where I got it to analyze audio utils.ts. And then these are others that I've done in the past, right? So this is where I added some memory to it, etc. So if I were to go back to one of these old ones, right, there's a bunch. So I picked up here, I picked up the history from here. Now, what happens if I've actually ended up going down some sort of rabbit holes here, right? Like, it's not uncommon that Claude Code will give us an answer and then I'll say, well, tell me more about that. And you sort of go down a separate thread. What if I want to, think of it as a Git commit history? And let's say each turn of the conversation is a new commit, if you like. And I'm like, okay, I want to get rid of these last 3 commits. I want to go back to a previous point in the conversation. Well, you can do that by, in this view, right, doing a double escape. Okay, so you click escape twice, and it'll tell you restore the code or conversation to the point before. So for example, if I click on this, what will end up happening is that all the stuff that happened after that will go away, right? I'm sort of resetting my head of the commit, so to speak, if you were to use git commit as a mental model. And if those of you aren't familiar with git commit and how you reset head and stuff like that, ignore that. Basically what we're saying is, assuming every one of these questions that you ask is a single snapshot, you want to go back in time to a previous snapshot and then sort of lose everything else, you can do that. So if you do double escape from the conversation interface here, you will be able to rewind your conversation and restore the code or the conversation to a point before. So this is really handy because it's doing the equivalent of a git reset head to something else, right? So that's a really, really useful thing to do. So why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this because by using these tools, you can make sure that you're able to control the context that you're providing to Claude at any point of time, right? Now, in Claude Code, the reason why the -- resume thing is useful is I don't necessarily want to use this conversation that has 68 messages about React and stuff like that when I'm speaking about the audio utils component, right? Or the audio utils helper functions. And that's because they've got very different state, like 68 message versus 8 message is a huge difference. And this one with 68 messages is going to have a whole lot of other stuff in its context that's going to confuse and fragment the attention of the agent. So it's often better to have different threads that are topic specific. And if you find you go down a rabbit hole, right, don't forget, you can always use the rewind ability to go back to a specific one and get rid of that rabbit hole that you went to. So you can always revert to a previous point in your conversation, to a previous level of code in your conversation. Now that's pretty handy because all that is controlling what Claude is focusing on. So the more you control the context, the higher quality responses you're going to get. And this is also going to be true when you're developing an app that uses LLMs. It's all about context engineering. Okay, it's literally, as of the end of 2025, seems to be far more important than fine-tuning based on what other folks are saying in the research world. And it seems to be the best way to get the most reliable outcomes from LLMs, which, remember, are famously non-deterministic. They can be a little unreliable in terms of what sort of response you're going to get. And if you try and give your agents too many things to do and too many things in its context, it's going to be less deterministic and less reliable. This is all about context management, which is extremely important to get high quality responses, whether you're using Claude Code or another LLM. The principle is the same. I love using Claude Code. I think it's fantastic. It's right up there with Codex, and I'm still experimenting with both because every week things change. So I flip and flop between them, but I don't think there's a clear winner in this race yet. I don't think anyone knows there is, and maybe there doesn't need to be a winner. You need to find what you're comfortable with, build the skills in it, and get good at it. And look, if you got any value out of this video, I know it's not the most polished. I'm very sort of natural and, fly by the seat of my pants when I do these, because I want you to see what it's like when I develop, or when I believe most developers develop. It's not as clearly planned and, well thought out as we'd like to believe it is. Often it can be when we're doing feature implementation, when you're just poking around in the repo. It's really not. So please like and subscribe if you think this is valuable to you, so that other people can also find out about it. And I keep getting juiced about putting more content like this. I can't do it very regularly as much as I'd like, but I'm trying to do them as and when I learn something new, or as and when I have a block of time to do it, because I really enjoy teaching you guys about this kind of stuff, because the pace of change is huge. And I think we just need to boil it down to simple mental models to get it really, to really stick with us. And the mental model for this one is context is everything. Do everything you can to control the context, because that's controlling the attention of the model, and that's going to help you a lot. All right, so don't forget, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.
Just subscribe. You know you got to do it.